All right, we are on our YouTube feed. Glad for anybody who's watching via YouTube today, and glad for all who are gathered here together this day. We are in the book of Acts. We are in the 9th chapter. We've been talking about the conversion of the Apostle Paul. We read about half of the chapter last week, and we're going to read a little bit more this week. We're not going to get through the whole of the chapter. We're taking our time as we go through Acts, and that's okay. We don't have any place to go, so we're going to go at our own pace with it. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. Last week we stopped with Paul going into Damascus and being cared for there and receiving his sight back. We pick up in the second half of verse 19 and read a few verses there, and we'll come back and talk about those first verses together. For several days, Paul was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues, saying, "He is the Son of God." All who heard him were amazed and said, "Is not this the man who made havoc in Jerusalem among those who invoked this name? And has he not come here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests?" Saul became increasingly more powerful and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. We have here in this section that we're looking at today, Luke's description of Paul's, well, we'll still call him Saul for the time being, Saul's post-conversion experiences. If you go to Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 through 24, you have the Apostle Paul telling the Galatians what he did after he became a Christian. And so scholars have debated between these two, thinking the one, is that Paul's account should be held over Luke's account, that they don't coincide. Others try to put them together, and I've given you William Barclay's synopsis of the two of them together, how they coincide and how they speak to what Saul was about in those days. I think that's the correct way to look at it. We have to remember that when Paul is talking in Galatians about what happened to him, he has an ulterior motive there. He's trying to demonstrate that the gospel he received came from Jesus Christ and not from the disciples, the apostles. And so he's trying to distinguish himself from the apostolic witness that was already in play. So, the way he tells his own account of things surely is the way things happened, but he's going to say it in such a way as to make the point he wants to make. And so we shouldn't get bent out of shape that they're not exactly lined up, perfectly together. In fact, I believe that you can put the two together and come up with a very good understanding of what Paul went through after his conversion to faith in Jesus Christ. So I've given you there in the notes that I've got for you, verses 15 through 24 in Galatians chapter 1. So let's read over those. This is Paul again speaking to the Galatians and talking about what happened to him and how he went about things after he had that Damascus Road experience. But when the one who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human. That's important for Paul to say in this. That's what drives most of all this. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once into Arabia, and afterward I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I did go up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, that is Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. And when I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by sight to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard it said, "The one who formerly was persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith he once tried to destroy." And they glorified God because of me. So that's Paul's own description of what he did after he became a believer, follower, an apostle. And then we have what Luke is laying out here in the book of Acts. So Barclays, I've got there for you in the notes, puts them together, and I think he pulls them together well. The text says for several days he was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues. Immediately, I think, means as soon as he was strong enough to do it, he started going to proclaim the gospel. And that's what Barclay says here. After his Damascus Road encounter of Christ, Paul preaches in Damascus, but only briefly. He then goes into Arabia, presumably for a period of preparation. That makes sense. I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. He returns and preaches for a period of 3 years in Damascus. So he has a 3-year time period in Damascus after his conversion. But looking at it from Luke's angle, it would appear that he immediately started preaching in the synagogues, and then he went away to Arabia, and then he came back and continued preaching in Damascus. He then goes to Jerusalem to visit the disciples and church leaders there. He is led from there by disciples of the Lord to Caesarea when persecution heats up, whereupon he returns to Syria and Cilicia. Again, you'll see that when we read further into the Acts account here about going to Jerusalem and to then going on to Syria and Cilicia. So that's kind of Barclay's pulling those two accounts together, and I think they make sense. And so what it seems to indicate is that right after Paul had regained his sight, a few days after he has had this experience, he rushes off to the synagogues to start preaching the gospel. But then, very shortly after that, he takes off and goes to Arabia. Why would he do that? Well, remember a couple weeks ago we talked about Philip when he was in Samaria? And I made the suggestion that, and I'm kind of out there on the end of the branch on that, I guess. I don't know that I saw anybody else who talked about that in commentary. But I think it makes sense from the text. Philip goes to Samaria and he preaches, and he leads Simon to the Lord. Well, as we talked about, when Peter and John come down to check out things, they find that several of the new disciples in Samaria don't really know what the Holy Spirit is about. And so they have to kind of correct that. And then Simon gives evidence that he's not really in it for the right reason. He became a Christian to get power so that he could continue his previous display of as a magician, of wowing people and doing mighty things. So Simon's heart wasn't really true. And so I made the suggestion, and I think the text warrants it, that Philip, was used by God to be sure, but he wasn't quite altogether ready to do the work that he needed to do. In other words, he needed a little bit of preparation. I think the same thing's going on here with Saul. He goes into the synagogue and he starts preaching, but then, the response he gets, I think he realized he was in over his head a little bit. And so Saul goes off to Arabia and spends, I would say, a very short amount of time there. We're not told anything about this experience in Arabia, which is interesting. Paul doesn't reference it in any other part of his letters other than what he says there in Galatians about having gone there. And it's not, it's not in the folklore about Paul, that he spent this great time in Arabia. We know that Jesus goes into the wilderness before he starts his ministry. That's in our gospel text, and we know how formative that experience was for him. But we're not told that about Paul. So I would assume that Saul's going there was probably on the order of about a month or so. But I would assume also that it was not unlike Jesus' time in the wilderness. Jesus, of course, is only there 40 days, right? But he's fasting and he's praying and he's being tested and he's getting everything together to begin his ministry. I think the same thing happened to Paul. He went into the synagogues and started preaching, and then, as we're going to see, he started experiencing some persecution. So I think he realized he needed to kind of get better grounded in things, needed to spend some time in prayer and in fasting. And so he went into Arabia and did that, and he came back to Damascus. And he enjoyed much success there, as Luke tells us. He enjoyed great success in Damascus for a season. And then, as we're going to see, he started to experience great persecution. For me, that makes everything kind of fit together. And it drives home one point that we need to take to heart, and that is the need for preparation, the need for seasoning. You know, somebody who becomes a Christian and joins the church, and they're all excited about wanting to serve God, especially as an adult, and they want to do all sorts of great things. And what do as a church? We just stick them right in there, right? We make them a teacher in this Sunday school class, and we do this and we do that. Well, that's not so wise. They need a season to be grounded in the faith. They need a season to kind of understand the parameters of what they're going to be about. And you know, Paul talks about this in his first letter to Timothy when he talks about deacons. You know, don't put somebody in there as a deacon who hasn't yet, you know, really been tested. They need to be tested. They need to demonstrate that they're ready for the work, and then put them into the job. So I think this kind of drives home that same point. You know, we send in Southern Baptist life what we used to do. You know, we would, as we talked about, we send our those who feel a call to ministry into the seminary, and they go to prepare for ministry. And we think that's a good thing. And we think that's a necessary thing. But you know, even after you get out of seminary, you still need a lot of seasoning. And so God bless the churches that receive the young ministers straight out of seminary. God bless those churches, because they've got very raw, material to work with. You know, the first church I served, Red House. Anybody know where Red House, Virginia is? A couple of you do. It's south of Appomattox. You go to Appomattox, you go south about 10, 12 miles. It's a little crossroads community. And just some wonderful, wonderful people there who took me under their wing, helped me out, and, you know, tolerated a lot of stuff that they, you know, probably wouldn't like to have tolerated. But anyway, that's, you know, you just can't help it. You're young, and you're stupid, and you're going to make mistakes, and you need some people to show you some grace. And, you know, again, thank the good Lord for churches who take in those pastors. And I wasn't just out of seminary. I had a couple of years at Farmville Baptist, but as an associate. But they were very gracious to me. I took my bumps a little bit, but deservedly so in some respects. Yes. Yes, and that's what a lot of young ministers do, right? They come out of seminary, they know everything. And, you know, this congregation, you know, they don't know anything. So it's my job to grow them up. So you know what happens. You've seen that happen many times. And so, again, thanks be to God for the grace that comes to those who are starting off in ministry that way. I really do think that's what's going on here. And I think that makes sense of the Luke and the Galatians passage in terms of, you know, starting off, he went to the seminary, started preaching, and then, you know, found out he needed to go and kind of pull back and figure things out a little bit better. And then he went back and he had good success. Now, also take note of what he's preaching there. I read right over it myself. Back in verse 20, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." Now, that doesn't really ruffle our feathers much, right? We think that's good stuff, right? What about those fellow Jews who were with Paul coming to take Christians away, as well as the Jews in the synagogues who weren't, you know, going to buy that one? That's blasphemy. Jesus is not the Son of God. Jesus is not God. And Paul himself would have said the same thing a couple weeks earlier, right? He's preaching that Jesus is the Son of God, the most horrendous thing for those Jewish ears to hear, and yet he's proclaiming it, which shows the distance he's traveled in such a short time, number one, but also shows how he's, you know, in the fire. This is going to stir up stuff, and he's going to get it even worse than others would because he knows better. But he's preaching that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus was the Messiah. Those are things that, you know, we're going to stir up the waters big time. Yeah, Scotty? Yes, yes, very much so. I believe he was a believer. Um, and yeah, we don't know anything else about him, but I do, yes, he is a believer because he was suspicious of Paul. When he was told by God to minister to him and to help him because he was going to make him into a servant of the church, and he was like, "Wait a second, are you sure about that?" So yeah, Ananias, yes, certainly I believe was a believer. Pick up in verse 23 now. And after some time had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. So he's been in Damascus, he's been preaching for a while, and he's going to be there for 3 years, we know. After some time had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night so that they might kill him. Kill him. We read by that too fast too. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. So after his return from Arabia, he's in Damascus. He's having success. He is confounding many of the non-believing Jews in the synagogues. And by the way, who else could do it but Saul? He was the enemy. He knows what the enemy thinks about the church. And so now that he is, for the church, he knows how to attack what those Pharisees, those zealous Pharisees, were about in fighting the church. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. As zealous as he was to persecute the church, in his ignorance, he is now that zealous to convert the unbelieving world to Jesus Christ. And right now, that unbelieving world involves Jews only. Yes. Yes, he had an expertise with the Old Testament, with the Hebrew Scripture, and was able to use it. And that's how he came. And again, when he's in Arabia, I'm sure he's going through the Hebrew Scriptures and seeing for the first time how they point to Jesus. And so that time in Arabia is a time where God's helping him to put it all together himself, so that it starts to make sense. Saul is he's preaching, he's having good success, but he's also stirring up the enemies against him. And that's the thing. The animus against the church is only growing. It's not growing weaker. And so where Saul certainly had an opportunity and certainly, had an entree that would have allowed him to minister, especially to those Pharisees. Maybe some of them are believing, maybe some of them are at least giving a hearing to it, but not all of them are by any stretch of the imagination. And so the animus is increasing. Perhaps they're all the more against the church because of Saul and his turn. They've lost one of their leading lights, and so now they're doubling down on coming after the church. Going to verse 26, when he had come to Jerusalem. So he leaves Damascus, and what is implied here is that when they let him down out of through the wall out of Damascus, there are other disciples who are helping him to get to Jerusalem. They want him to get to the Jerusalem church, right? That makes perfect sense. When he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. He's attempting to join the disciples. That's, that doesn't mean necessarily he wants to become a member of the church at Jerusalem. It's that he wants to, come into their fellowship, and to be known by them and to figure out what he's going to do ministry-wise as a part of the church. He has felt the call. He knows the call. He's already been out preaching the gospel. He knows he's a minister of Jesus Christ. And so, he's going to the mother church to get his bearings, to make the connections he needs to make in order that he can get going. But he rates a frosty reception, a very frosty reception. Let's continue on for a second. But Barnabas took him brought him to the apostles and described for them how on the road he had seen the Lord who had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken boldly in the name of Jesus. So he went in and out among them in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. He spoke and argued with the Hellenists, that is the Greek-speaking, Greek culture Jews in the synagogues, but they were attempting to kill him. When the brothers and sisters learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Meanwhile, the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria had peace and was built up, living in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit. It increased in numbers. Interesting, we stop with Paul's story there right at the end, and you get Luke tells you everything. By the way, everything in the church is going swimmingly. Things are moving forward. I guess Luke doesn't want everybody to get the impression that because Paul is, experiencing some of the persecution he's experiencing and people are trying to kill him, that, the church is going down the tubes. No, the church is actually increasing. And that, brings up an interesting connecting point there. It's usually when the church is being persecuted that it grows. When we have easy times, we tend to take the spirit of the age and coast. But when persecution comes and, being a Christian means something serious, people start to join us. People start to, the church actually starts to grow when that happens. That seems to be what's going on here as well. Go back up to the first part of that, of course. He receives a frosty reception. We understand that completely. I mean, this is the church in Jerusalem. Saul had a reputation for going from synagogue to synagogue and dragging Christians out in chains. Saul was obviously instrumental in some way more than what the text tells us with Stephen's stoning. And don't you know, the believers in Jerusalem remembered that. And so, what better way for a Pharisee to get into the church and wreak havoc and take a lot of Christians away than to pretend to be a disciple? So they're wise. They're actually pretty wise. But God has provided for Saul here again. And part of Paul's story all throughout Acts, he ministers, he endures persecution, and God sends somebody his way to help him. Or God opens the door at the right moment, or God intervenes in a miraculous sort of way. As God has called Paul, to suffer for the gospel, he also provides for him the means to survive and to continue on with his ministry. And we see that here. It really was probably a rude awakening for him when he got the cold shoulder from the church. Because, he's coming from Damascus where, he's running for his life essentially. And you go to the mother church and it's like, oh, good, now I'm among friends. Well, they're not really sure about you either. This does kind of mirror Paul's experience all throughout his ministry. He always is kind of the outsider. I hadn't thought about it till I was reflecting on this. But Paul is really kind of always the outsider. He's not one of the original 12, number one. He's a persecutor of the church. He has this dramatic Damascus Road experience that none of the other disciples ever had, none of the other apostles ever had. And then he's going to take the gospel to the Gentiles. He's going to push the church to go beyond the Jewish world to the Gentiles, which is going to ruffle a whole lot of feathers. Paul is really always the outsider. And even when they granted him his ministry to the Gentiles, he still endured a lot of grief for it. So he's never really truly an apostle because he wasn't one of the original 12. And he's pushing the church to do things it's not supposed to do, maybe. And so he's always kind of the outsider. And this story kind of foreshadows that, I think, in some respects. He's running for his life from the Jews in Damascus, but he's also getting this frosty reception from the believers in Jerusalem, the mother church of all things. So God provides for him, and he provides for him Barnabas. We talked about Barnabas previously. Remember where and when? Chapter 4, at the end of the chapter. Barnabas sells property. He sells some of his property and he gives proceeds to the church. In chapter 5, the first verse, who do we meet? Ananias and Sapphira. And what do? They sell property and hold back a certain amount of it. And so Barnabas is introduced to us in contrast to Ananias and Sapphira. His graciousness, his generosity, his sincere faith, in contrast to the manipulative kind of behavior on view in Ananias and Sapphira. So that's where we're introduced to him. The text tells us in the end of chapter 4 that the disciples, he is Joseph originally, Joseph, and they name him Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, yes. So his gracious spirit, his kind demeanor is already present in the church, and he's the right guy to do for Saul what needs to be done in this moment. But hold on just a second. Let's flash forward, and you know that Barnabas is the one with whom Paul starts off on the missionary journey. Barnabas calls Paul to Antioch when they start preaching the gospel to the Gentile world. And so Paul and Barnabas, unite together to do great things. But then there's a disagreement. John Mark, he fumbles the ball somewhere along the way in ministry. And Paul says, let's leave him back home. We're not going to take him with us this time. And Barnabas wants to give him a second chance. You see Barnabas' spirit really is a genuine, loving, kind, gracious spirit. And it's exactly what Paul needs in this moment in the church. Paul needs somebody to run interference. He needs somebody to introduce him to the congregation. He needs somebody to vouch for him. And Barnabas is the one who does that. Now, verse 27, but Barnabas took him, brought him to the apostles, and described for them how on the road. He tells Paul's story of his conversion. Now it says he brought him to the apostles. And in Galatians, remember, Paul says, I only talked to Peter and to James, the Lord's brother. And so there seems to be a discrepancy there. Again, Paul's trying to emphasize that the gospel he has came straight from Jesus Christ and not from any human source to the Galatian believers. And so, he's going to tell the story that way in order to make that point. Not that he's lying, but just that he's telling it that way. Luke is just saying he was taken to the apostles. We can imagine that among those who gave a frosty reception to him were the apostles, right? And so it would appear that, from Luke's telling of things, that Barnabas was able to at least get him on good terms with Peter and with James, the Lord's brother. Maybe not all the apostles were friendly at that particular point yet. But, James is considered apostolic in his leadership, and Peter certainly is an apostle. So anyway, Barnabas is opening doors and helping him to be accepted by the church, and this works. And so Paul is able to begin to minister in Jerusalem and do the same things there that he had done in Damascus. And he's going evidently he's going to the Greek-speaking synagogues. We see that he's disputing, that just means arguing, not in the bad sense arguing, but presenting the gospel and debating back and forth about the validity of the gospel from the Hebrew perspective. And so he's going to the Greek-speaking synagogues. So he's already, we see, he's the apostle to the Gentiles. Whether he already had a notion that was his calling or whether he was just starting to understand it, he's already starting to minister to the Greek-speaking Jews there in Jerusalem. And he's already engaging in serious ministry with them, and it's already riling them up because they too want to kill him. So he gets rescued. He has to get ushered out of town again. Paul is on the run. He's always on the run. He goes and he ministers and he stirs up trouble and he gets chased out of town. He's a very disreputable sort of fellow. But that's his calling. And so he gets taken out of town down to Caesarea. Interestingly, we're going to read when we get towards the end of Acts, when Paul goes back to Jerusalem knowing he's going to be arrested, and sensing that this is the momentous journey where he's going to go before Caesar and preach the gospel. It's in Caesarea. It's from Caesarea that he embarks to Jerusalem. So you can see, here at the beginning, it's to Caesarea. He goes from Jerusalem, and from Caesarea, he's going to go out into the world. He's not going to be tied to Jerusalem. But at the end of his journeys, before he is arrested for the final time, he comes back to Jerusalem from Caesarea. That's where he comes. Philip is in Caesarea. His daughters are prophetesses, and they prophesy his demise. And it's from Caesarea that he goes to Jerusalem, knowing that imprisonment awaits him. Well, the great lesson for us from Barnabas, and really, Barnabas is a secondary figure, but really he is a very important figure. If it weren't for Barnabas, sure, God could have chosen anybody and everybody, and God could have called somebody else up to help Paul get going. But Barnabas is the one. Without Barnabas, Paul's story is very different. And so Barnabas is really an unsung hero. He deserves more attention and more respect and admiration than we usually give him. But his example is what I want to leave you with today. Bridge people. We need to be bridge people. When somebody new comes into the church, or somebody's kind of circulating around the church, you know how hard it is to get into the church? You don't know because most of y'all have been here for a long, long, long time. But you can remember if you came somewhere along the way, if you didn't actually grow up in this church. It's hard to get into a church. And you can be there for 20 years and still be trying to get into the church. It's hard to make your way into the church, to really and truly be accepted by the church, to really and truly become one of the church people. And so we all have a responsibility to be Barnabas to some of those folks, and to reach out to them, and to help build bridges between them and the people in the church, to introduce them, to vouch for them. If they're somebody from, up north or Texas or one of those other crazy places, I said that for Rand because he always hates it when I say something bad about Texas. But anyway, yes, cliques in the church. Yes, we all have our favorite people that we love to be around, that we feel most comfortable with, and we don't mean to exclude anybody, but we do. And so we need bridge people. We need people who will take those folks by the hand and bring them in among us and help them fit in. Yes, Scotty? Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, Scotty's saying here, for anybody who's listening on YouTube, Scotty's saying that a lot of churches put the onus on the newcomer to prove his or herself to the church. And we need to reverse that. We need to put the onus on us to reach out to them and to embrace them and to bring them in. And so, yes, when you develop the fellowship and relationship with that person, you bring them into your circle of people. We don't assume that they're going to get in there on their own. We make it our job to help them get in there on their own. We're trying to build community here. We're trying to increase the body of Jesus Christ. We're trying to grow in our fellowship together, our knowledge of each other, our love for each other. We're trying to make that grow and grow and grow and grow. And we want other people to come and join us. Where else should people experience the love of God than in the community of the church, the communion of the people who belong to Jesus Christ? And that's our job, all of us. And yes, Scotty, you're right. Every church I've been a part of, it's just part of human nature. You know, you close ranks around your group, and you kind of hold the others at it's just human nature. So we got to fight human nature and be intentionally welcoming to those who are new and to those who are skeptical of us, and help be bridge people for them. Final thoughts, questions, comments? All right. The Lord willing, we will come back again next Wednesday and continue on. We get to hear about Peter once again. Peter's time in Acts is coming to a close, but we're going to get to hear about him one more time. Debbie, prayer team meeting. All right. Thank you for anybody who's been watching on YouTube. We appreciate you tuning in today.